The laughter hit Abigail Thornton like a slap before she even reached the platform steps. 3 men stood near the station entrance, broad-shouldered ranchers in mud-caked boots, the kind of men who had probably never questioned whether they belonged anywhere. One of them had found her advertisement reply somehow, the letter she had written to Cole Brennan, and he was reading it aloud to the others in a high-pitched mockery of a woman's voice. "I've spent my life rebuilding broken people," he read, then dropped the falsetto and laughed. "A nursemaid. He went and ordered himself a nursemaid. 56 years old, and she thinks she's coming out here to play wife." The second man shook his head. "Cole Brennan's lost more than his arm if he thinks that old crow is going to last one winter." Abigail stopped walking. She stood completely still on the platform, her worn suitcase in hand, the cold Wyoming wind pulling at the silver hair she had pinned back that morning in the dark of a moving train car. She heard every word, every single one. She did not cry. She did not turn around. She picked up her suitcase and walked straight past them without looking at their faces. If you've ever been told your best years are already gone, if someone has ever looked at you and seen only what time has taken instead of what it has built, then stay with this story. Like this video, drop a comment with your city and country so I can see how far this journey travels, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what happened in Cheyenne, Wyoming in the autumn of 1874 is the kind of story that doesn't let go. The train had been 3 days out of St. Louis, and Abigail had spent most of those days in the same window seat, watching the land change from something familiar into something that felt like the edge of the world. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had held the hands of dying men during the war, had cleaned wounds that would have made younger nurses faint, had buried children she had nursed through fever only to lose them anyway. She had survived her husband Thomas's slow disappearance into illness, had managed his affairs, settled his debts, and then stood at his grave on a Tuesday morning in April and felt the strange, terrible lightness of a woman with no one left to take care of. That lightness had nearly destroyed her. Not grief, exactly. She knew grief. Grief was loud and demanding and at least kept you busy. What settled over her in the months after Thomas died was something quieter and worse, the sense that the world had simply stopped requiring her. The orphanage where she had volunteered for 11 years had a new director who brought his own staff. The neighbors who had relied on her during the war years had rebuilt their own lives. Her sister in Philadelphia wrote kind letters that always, without fail, ended with some variation of, "You could come stay with us, Abigail, until you get settled." Until you get settled, as though she were a piece of furniture that had fallen off a wagon and needed to be put somewhere out of the road. She had found Cole Brennan's advertisement on a Thursday in late August, in a newspaper she had picked up mainly because it was raining and she needed something to do with her hands. Most of the mail-order advertisements were the same. Men describing their land holdings and their prospects and their Christian character, looking for young women to build families with. Cole's was not like that. "I have one arm before I have anything else worth mentioning," it began. "Lost the left one 3 years back in a logging accident. I run a cattle ranch outside Cheyenne in the Wyoming Territory, about 200 acres, not much to look at, but it works if you work it. I am 38 years old. I can ride, rope, and manage the property well enough, but the house is a wreck, and I'll be honest about that too. I'm not looking for a young woman with romantic notions. I'm looking for a practical partner. If you are sensible and not afraid of hard work and can tolerate a man who will never be able to hold you with both arms, write to me." She had read it 3 times. Then she had set down the newspaper, walked to her writing desk, and written back. "Dear Mr. Brennan, I've spent my life rebuilding broken people. I don't mistake scars for weakness. I am 56 years old, a widow, and I have no romantic notions left to speak of. I have considerable experience with medical care, food preservation, livestock management in small quantities, and keeping order in chaotic situations. I am not afraid of Wyoming. I'm afraid of becoming unnecessary. If that sounds like something you can work with, write back." She had not expected him to reply within the week. His second letter was shorter than the first, and somehow more honest. He wrote that he had shown her letter to his foreman, a man named Dix Calloway, and that Dix had said, "Cole, if you don't write that woman back immediately, I will fire myself out of pure disgust." He wrote that he had laughed for the first time in months reading that. He wrote that he would meet her at the Cheyenne station on October the 4th, if she was willing, and that he would be wearing a brown coat and holding his hat in his only hand because he had been told that was what a man did when meeting a woman for the first time, and he wanted to at least get that part right. She had written back, October the 4th, brown coat, I'll find you. And now here she was. The three men near the station entrance had gone quiet when she walked past them, which was something. She didn't look back to see their expressions. She scanned the platform methodically, a habit from years of moving through crowded field hospitals, until she found what she was looking for. He was standing slightly apart from the crowd, near the far end of the platform where the wooden boards were warped and gray. The brown coat was exactly as advertised. The left sleeve was pinned up at the elbow. He was holding his hat in his right hand, and he was watching the arriving passengers with an expression that Abigail recognized immediately because she had worn it herself on many occasions. The specific look of a person who is absolutely certain they are about to be disappointed. She walked toward him without hesitating. He saw her coming, and the expression shifted, not into relief exactly, but into something more careful. He was trying to read her face the way she was reading his. She noticed the lines around his eyes, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward like a man accustomed to compensating. He was younger than she'd expected him to look, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. She stopped in front of him. "Mr. Brennan," she said. "Mrs. Thornton." He put his hat back on. "You made it. I said I would." "Yes." He glanced down at her suitcase, and she could see him calculating whether he could carry it one-handed without making a production of the attempt. "I can manage that," she said simply, and kept hold of it. Something in his face relaxed fractionally. "My wagon's out front," he said. "It's about 2 hours to the ranch if the road's dry, which it isn't, more like 3. "That's fine." They walked off the platform together. As they passed the group of men near the entrance, Abigail heard one of them mutter something low, but she was already past them, matching Cole's stride across the uneven ground toward the street, and she didn't slow down. Cole heard it too. She could tell by the slight tightening of his jaw, but he didn't stop either. "Those men cause you trouble?" he asked when they were clear of the station. "Not particularly," she said. "I've had worse." He looked at her sideways. "They were reading your letter out loud earlier, before the train came in. I came over and asked them to stop, and one of them stopped." "It doesn't matter." "What did they say?" He shook his head. "Nothing worth repeating." "Mr. Brennan." Her tone was not unkind, but it was firm. "I'm going to hear worse than whatever they said before this winter is out. I'd rather know what I'm walking into." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Harlan Griggs, the one with the red beard, said that hiring a housekeeper would have been cheaper and less embarrassing. He said I'd clearly lost my mind along with my arm." Cole paused. "I told him that at least I still had both of those things, which was more than I could say for his manners or his judgment. Then he said something about your age that I'm not going to repeat because I was raised better than that." Abigail considered this as they reached the wagon. "Harlan Griggs? He's a local rancher? His family's been here 20 years. He runs about 400 head. Thinks that gives him the right to an opinion on everything." "Does he have a wife?" "Third one. The other 2 left." Abigail nodded slowly. "I see." Cole climbed up to the wagon seat with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent years recalibrating every movement. Abigail climbed up beside him without being asked and set her suitcase behind the seat. He picked up the reins with his right hand. "You ride?" he asked. "I drove ambulance wagons during the war," she said. "I can take the reins if you need." He glanced at her. "I've been managing the reins one-handed for 3 years." "I didn't say you couldn't." Another sideways look, then something that was almost a smile. "Fair enough." They pulled out of Cheyenne into the open land, and Abigail watched the town fall away behind them. The sky was enormous out here, gray and pressing low, and the wind had the particular cold bite of a place that was not going to apologize for itself. She had been afraid, getting on the train in St. Louis. She hadn't admitted it to herself at the time. She'd been too busy being practical, making lists, deciding what to pack. But sitting now in this wagon next to a man she had met 20 minutes ago, heading toward a house she'd never seen in a territory that felt like it had been designed to discourage human habitation, she felt the fear settle clearly into view. It was not fear of Cole. Not exactly. It was the fear of having made the largest decision of her second life based on 2 letters and an advertisement, and discovering in the next 3 hours that she had misread everything. She had survived worse fears, but she wanted to be honest with herself about this one. "Tell me about the ranch hands," she said, because practical questions were better than silence. 3 of them. "Dix Calloway's the foreman. You'll like him. He's sensible. Ramon Torres has been with me 6 years. He's the best horseman I've ever seen. And then there's a young man named Eli Pruitt, 16 years old, came to me 2 summers ago with nowhere else to go. He works hard. He's scared of most things, but he doesn't let it stop him." "And the house?" Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "I told you in the letter it was a wreck." "I know what you said. I'm asking you to be specific." He exhaled. "The roof on the east side leaks when it rains heavily. The kitchen stove works, but the flue needs cleaning. There are 3 rooms I've been using and 2 more that I closed off when my last housekeeper quit 3 years ago, and I haven't been in them since. The well is good. The root cellar is stocked adequately for 1 person through winter, which means it's not stocked adequately for 2. Abigail made a mental inventory. What did the last housekeeper quit over? Silence. Then, "She said the isolation was too much." "Was that all?" Longer silence. "She also said I was difficult to be around." Abigail looked at him directly for the first time since they'd left the station. He was staring at the road ahead. "Are you?" she asked. He considered this with what she was starting to recognize as his characteristic seriousness. "I'm not much for conversation when I don't have anything to say. Some people find that rude. I don't like things moved without being told where they've gone, because I've arranged everything to work with one hand, and when something's in a different place, I can lose 20 minutes finding it. I get up at 4:30, and I expect the ranch work to start at 5, and if someone's not there, I'll go looking rather than wait. And He stopped. "And?" "I have difficult nights sometimes," he said, more quietly. "Since the accident. I don't always sleep well, and sometimes I'm not good company in the morning." She nodded. "Thomas had difficult nights for the last 2 years of his life. I know what that looks like." He finally looked at her. "What did you do?" "I let him have them," she said. "Difficult nights aren't something you fix. You just make sure the morning is there when they're over." Cole turned back to the road. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, "Dix told me not to be an idiot and scare you off in the first 10 minutes. "You haven't," she said. "We've still got 2.5 hours. You're doing fine, Mr. Brennan." The wagon rolled on. The sky got lower, and Abigail Thornton, who had spent 30 years rebuilding other people's lives, began quietly taking stock of this new one. The ranch appeared through the gray afternoon light, like something that had grown out of the land rather than been built on it. Low and dark, the main house solid enough, but scoured raw by years of Wyoming wind. A barn stood to the north, bigger than she'd expected. 3 horses moved in the corral near it. Someone had left a bucket sitting in the middle of the yard, which would ice over overnight and become a problem, and she noted it without saying anything. Dix Calloway came out of the barn when he heard the wagon, and Abigail's first impression of him was a man who had been watching for them and was trying not to look like he had been. He was in his mid-50s, weathered and square-built, with a gray beard and the particular ease of a man comfortable in his body and his work. He looked at Abigail with open, frank curiosity. "Mrs. Thornton," Cole said. "This is Dix." Dix pulled off his hat. "Ma'am, welcome to the Brennan Ranch. We're glad you're here." "Thank you," she said, climbing down before either of them could feel obligated to help. "I see you've left a water bucket in the yard where it'll freeze." Dix blinked. Then he turned to look at the bucket. Then he turned back, and the corner of his mouth pulled up. "Ramon was supposed to move that this morning." "I'll remind him," Cole said. "No need," Abigail said. "I'll move it myself." She picked up her suitcase. "Which door?" They showed her the house. Cole had not understated the state of it, but he had also not fully described the ways in which it had clearly once been cared for. The careful construction of the window frames, the solid hearthstone, the pantry that was well designed even if currently disorganized. Someone had built this house with intention. It had just been left alone too long. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, taking inventory. The flue was filthy, which meant a fire risk. The pantry shelves held enough salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, and preserved tomatoes to get 2 people through winter if she was careful, but not if she wasn't. The leaking roof was on the east bedroom, which she would need to address before the first heavy snow because moisture in the walls over winter would mean rot by spring, and rot by spring would mean structural damage that cost 5 times what the repair would cost now. She turned around. Cole was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her with that careful, reading expression. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking the flue needs cleaning tomorrow, not next week," she said. "I'm thinking I'll need to know what materials you have for the roof patch. I'm thinking the pantry needs to be reorganized so you can find things one-handed without having to move 6 items to reach the one you want." She paused. "And I'm thinking whoever designed this kitchen knew what they were doing." Something moved through his face. "My mother," he said after a moment. "She came out with my father when they first homesteaded. She designed it. She was practical." "She was." Abigail set her suitcase down near the table. "Mr. Brennan, I think we should marry as soon as can reasonably be arranged. Not for any sentimental reason, because I can't effectively manage this house or make decisions about the property as a guest, and because I don't intend to be a guest." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a justice of the peace in Cheyenne. I can send word tomorrow." "Good." "You're sure?" "I said I would come," she said. "I don't say things I don't mean." He nodded slowly. "All right, there's one more thing I should tell you before you unpack." She waited. "Harlan Griggs came by last week," Cole said. "He's heard I was sending for someone. He told me—" A pause. "He told me that a one-armed rancher who couldn't even find a real wife was going to find it hard to keep his grazing rights when the land association renegotiates in the spring. He implied that my standing in the region would be better if I came to certain arrangements with him. Shared cattle management, his terms." Abigail was very still. "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind where his operation expands and mine becomes part of it in all but name." "And if you refused?" Cole's jaw was tight. He said that men who couldn't manage their own affairs sometimes found that others managed them for them. The kitchen was quiet. The wind pushed against the window glass. "He's been planning this," Abigail said. "The land association renegotiation. When exactly?" "March. 4 months. And he thinks your position is weak because you're one-armed and alone." "That's what he thinks." Abigail looked around the kitchen again, recalculating. The pantry, the roof, the flue, the root cellar that needed restocking. 4 months. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "move that bucket out of the yard and then come find me. I need to look at your account books." He stared at her. "My account books. If Harlan Griggs thinks your affairs are in disorder, I want to know exactly which ones are and which ones aren't before he finds a way to use them against you." She picked up her suitcase and looked around for the bedroom he'd intended for her. "And tomorrow after the flue is cleaned, I'd like to meet the neighbors who are not Harlan Griggs, the ones who might be worth knowing." Cole stood in the kitchen doorway for another moment. "Dix told me not to scare you off," he said again, but this time there was something different under the words. Something closer to disbelief, as though he hadn't quite expected to mean it yet. "I already told you," Abigail said. "You haven't." She found the bedroom and set her suitcase on the bed and stood very still for a moment with her hand on the worn leather handle, the wind pressing hard against the east wall, the one with the leaking roof, and thought about the look on Harlan Griggs's face as described by a man who hadn't flinched telling her about it. She had spent 30 years in rooms with powerful men who had decided someone smaller than them didn't count. She knew exactly what that look looked like. And she had learned, a long time ago, that the most effective response to that look was never the one those men expected. She opened her suitcase and began to unpack. It took her the better part of an hour to get her things settled, and when she came back to the kitchen, Cole was at the table with 3 leather account ledgers spread open and a lamp pulled close. He had moved the bucket, she noted. And someone, Dix, she suspected, had added wood to the firebox. She sat across from him and he turned the ledgers to face her. She read carefully. She read the way she had once read medical charts, looking for patterns, for the thing that should be there but wasn't, for the small notations that told the real story underneath the official one. The ranch was not failing. That was the first thing. The operation was lean and disciplined, and Cole managed it with the kind of controlled efficiency she associated with people who had no margin for waste. The cattle numbers were solid. The debts were modest and well managed. The grazing lease payments were current. But there were 3 entries in the last 8 months that she went back to twice. "What is this?" she asked, pointing. Cole leaned forward. "Fence repairs. North pasture." "This much?" "The fence came down in a July storm. Cattle got out onto Griggs's land. He charged me for the retrieval." "And this?" She pointed to the second entry. Cole's expression flattened. "Water rights dispute. I had to pay a filing fee to contest his claim to the creek that runs through the east corner." "Did you win the contest?" "It's still pending." She pointed to the third entry. "Survey fee," he said. "Griggs claimed my north fence was 8 feet onto his land. I paid to have it resurveyed. It wasn't." Abigail sat back. "He's been bleeding you," she said. "Small amounts." "That's the point. Small enough that each one looks like ordinary bad luck or a routine dispute. Large enough that over 8 months they add up to—" She did the mental arithmetic. "Nearly 2 months of operating costs." Cole was quiet. "Has anyone else in the region had similar disputes with him?" she asked. "The Pettifer family. Lost a water rights case to him in August. The widow Hennessy. Her fence got damaged in the same July storm, but her cattle ended up on my land, not his, so he didn't charge for retrieval. He helped her instead. Helped himself to a seat at her table as well, apparently. He's establishing which neighbors he needs and which ones he's planning to take. That's my read." Abigail looked at the ledgers again. "You need 3 things before March," she said. "You need your operating costs reduced so that these small bleedings hurt less. You need documentation of every dispute, every fee, every claim he's filed against you, in one place with dates and witnesses. And you need allies in the land association who are not in his pocket. That's a great deal to accomplish in 4 months." "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked up at him. "Do you have a blank ledger book?" He blinked. "I think there's one in the supply chest." "Get it for me, please, and then I need you to tell me the name of every rancher and settler within 20 miles that you know, what you know about their relationship with Griggs, and whether they've had any unexplained runs of bad luck in the last year." Cole stared at her across the table. "You came prepared," he said slowly. "I came practical," she corrected. "There's a difference." She held out her hand for the ledger book when he found it. "You said you were looking for a partner." "I did." "This is what that looks like." He set the blank ledger in front of her. She opened it to the first page, picked up the pen, and wrote the date at the top in her clean, precise hand. Outside, the Wyoming wind had picked up, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. The lamp flame leaned sideways and steadied. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses stamped. Cole leaned back in his chair and watched her write, and the expression on his face was not the one he had worn on the platform. That careful, braced for disappointment look. It was something quieter than that, something he probably hadn't felt in a while. She didn't look up to see it. She was already working. They were married on a Wednesday, 8 days after Abigail stepped off the train. The justice of the peace was a small man named Aldrich Foote, who smelled of pipe tobacco and conducted the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of someone who had performed it many times and held no illusions about what he was witnessing. There were no flowers. Dix Calloway stood as witness, holding his hat in both hands and looking at the floor during the vows with the studied inattention of a man trying to give people their privacy in a room with no privacy to give. Ramon Torres waited outside with the wagon. Young Eli Pruitt had wanted to come, but Cole had told him someone needed to stay with the livestock, which was true, and also meant the boy wouldn't have to stand in a government office watching his employer do something the whole territory was already talking about. Cole said his vows in the same direct, unadorned way he said everything. Abigail said hers clearly and without hesitation. When Foote asked Cole to place the ring, a plain silver band that had been his mother's. Cole did it with his right hand, and his fingers were steadier than Abigail had expected, though she could feel the slight tension in them. "Congratulations," Foote said, and shook Cole's hand, and then looked at Abigail as though he was trying to decide whether she required congratulations or condolences, and wisely said nothing further. Outside, Dix shook Cole's hand and then turned to Abigail and said, "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Brennan," and the name landed strangely, not badly, just differently than she'd anticipated, the way a new coat feels the first time you button it in weather. "Thank you, Dix," she said. "He's going to be difficult sometimes," Dix said quietly, while Cole was signing the final paperwork. "Just so you know." "He told me." Dix looked surprised. "He told you that himself?" "He did." Dix appeared to consider this for a moment. "Huh," he said, and seemed to find it encouraging. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride into town had been, which Abigail hadn't thought possible. Cole drove. The sky was flat and white, the kind of sky that couldn't decide whether to snow or simply threaten it. She was aware of him beside her in a way that was different from the awareness of 8 days ago. Not more intimate exactly, but more permanent. The way you become aware of a piece of furniture you've decided to keep. She thought that was probably a strange thing to think about a husband, and then decided it was honest, which was more important. "The Pettifer Ranch is 3 miles east of ours," Cole said eventually. "Margaret Pettifer. Her husband died 2 years ago. She runs it with her 2 sons. She's one of the people I mentioned, the water rights case." "I remember," Abigail said. "Is she the kind of woman who'll talk to me, or the kind who'll wait to see what I am first?" Cole thought about it. "She'll wait. But she's fair." "Good. I'd rather be judged fairly than welcomed warmly." He glanced at her. "Most people would rather be welcomed." "Most people haven't spent 30 years in field hospitals," Abigail said. "You learn quickly that warm welcomes don't tell you much. Someone willing to look at you honestly and then decide, that's worth having." They turned onto the road that led to the ranch, and Cole said, "I need to go over the north fence line this week. There was another incident." She turned to look at him. "What kind of incident?" His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was containing something. "One of Griggs's men came by yesterday morning while you were cleaning the flue. Said a section of my north fence was down and Griggs's cattle had wandered through. Said he was being neighborly by telling me. But I rode up there yesterday afternoon and the fence wasn't down, it had been cut. The wagon wheel hit a frozen rut and they both shifted with it." "Cut," she repeated. "Not broken, not damaged in any natural way. 3 wires, clean through, the kind of cut you make with a good pair of snips, not the kind a fence makes when it fails. Did you document it?" "I walked the line and I know where it is." He paused. "I didn't write it down." "We will write it down today," she said, "and I need to know which of Griggs's men came to tell you about it." "Fellow named Cutter Walsh, works for Griggs going on 5 years. Cutter Walsh. And what did you say to him?" "I thanked him for letting me know and watched him ride off. I didn't want him to know I was going to look." Abigail nodded slowly. That was smart. Smarter than she might have expected from a man in the first flush of anger, which meant Cole had been managing his anger at Harlan Griggs for long enough that he'd gotten good at it. That was useful and also, she thought, quietly exhausting for him. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "Not the documented incidents, the general pressure." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Since the accident," he said. "Before that, Griggs left me alone. My father and his father had the usual neighborly disagreements, but nothing like this. When I came back from the logging camp with one arm and my father's ranch to run alone," he stopped, started again. "He came by that first week, brought a bottle of whiskey, said he was sorry about what happened, said if I ever needed help managing things, I should let him know." A pause. The way he said it made clear exactly what kind of help he meant. "He saw an opportunity. I told him I was fine. He smiled and said he was glad to hear it and rode off. 3 weeks later, his men started riding my fence lines every day. I started finding boundary markers moved. Nothing I could prove." Cole's voice had gone flat in a way that was different from his ordinary quietness. A flatness with something tight under it, the way ice sounds different when there's water moving beneath. I learned to document. I learned to survey. I learned the land association rules better than half the men who've been in this territory 20 years. I was managing. You were managing alone, Abigail said. He didn't answer that. You're not alone now, she said. Not warmly. Practically. The way you'd tell someone the roof was repaired. It's done. It's solid. Lean on it. He didn't answer that either, but his grip on the reins shifted slightly, and she took that as acknowledgement. The first real test of what the neighbors thought of them came 4 days later at the Hendersons' place 6 miles southwest. The Hendersons ran a small spread. Roy Henderson and his wife Clara and their daughter Nettie, who was about 20 and had a frank, watchful face. Roy had invited Cole to come look at a bull he was thinking of selling, and Cole had told Abigail about it the night before in a tone that made clear he was deciding whether to bring her or leave her at the ranch, and was trying to determine which was more appropriate without asking her directly. She solved the problem by being ready to go when he came in for breakfast. Clara Henderson met them in the yard with a look that Abigail recognized as the evaluating kind. Not hostile, just thorough. She was in her mid-40s, red-handed from morning work, with the straight-backed posture of a woman who had built herself out of difficult material and wasn't apologetic about what the building had required. "Mrs. Brennan," Clara said, and shook her hand with a grip that was probably calibrated to see if Abigail would wince. She didn't. "Mrs. Henderson," Abigail said, "thank you for having us." Clara studied her face for about 3 seconds. Then she said, "Come in, coffee's on," which Abigail understood was the verdict. The men went to look at the bull. The women went inside, and Nettie set cups on the table with the careful movements of a girl who had been told to behave and was deciding independently what that meant. Clara poured coffee and sat down across from Abigail and said, without preamble, "Half the county thinks he's lost his mind." "I know," Abigail said. "The other half thinks you're running some kind of scheme." "What kind of scheme?" "Widow comes out, gets her name on the property, waits for him to have another accident." Abigail picked up her cup. The coffee was strong and slightly burned, which she didn't mind. "And what do you think?" Clara looked at her for a long moment. "I think a woman who wanted to run that kind of scheme would have made herself a great deal more charming at this table." "Charm takes energy I'd rather spend on the flu and the roof patch." Clara's mouth twitched. "He said in his letter he needed someone practical." "He did. You knew about the arm before you came?" His advertisement led with it. "Most women wouldn't—" Clara stopped. "Well, most women have more choices," Abigail said. "I had good options and one honest one. I took the honest one." Nettie, who had been standing near the window pretending not to listen, turned around at that. She had the look of a girl storing things for later. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Harlan Griggs came by last week," she said. The shift in her voice was slight but definite. "He wanted Roy to sign a letter of support for his land association proposal. Something about consolidating the water rights filings for smaller ranches under a regional management committee." She watched Abigail's face. "Roy hasn't signed anything. He told Griggs he needed time to read it." "What did Griggs say to that?" "He said he understood and he hoped Roy's hay supply would hold through a long winter." Clara's voice was entirely level. "And then he looked at our south-facing barn, where we lost most of the roof in July, and said he hoped we weren't going to have any more bad luck with structures." Abigail set down her cup. "He threatened you." "He was neighborly about it." "Mrs. Henderson," Abigail looked at her directly, "has Roy shown that letter to anyone?" "Not yet." "I'd like to see it if you're willing. I have some experience reading the kind of language that means one thing on paper and another in practice." Clara studied her for a moment. Then she stood up, went to a narrow chest near the window, and came back with a folded document. She set it on the table between them. Abigail read it. It took her 7 minutes, and in those 7 minutes she read it 3 times. Once for what it said, once for what it didn't say, once for what it would mean once Griggs had enough signatures to take it to the Land Association Board. By the 3rd reading, her hands were very still on the table, and she was thinking about the blank ledger book back at the ranch with the first 12 pages already filled. "This language here," she said, pointing to the 3rd paragraph. This clause about regional management authority over shared water infrastructure. Do you see what it doesn't specify? Clara leaned over. What? Who sits on the regional management committee? Who determines what shared means? Who has the authority to rule a private water source a shared resource? Abigail looked up. Once this is signed by enough landowners and ratified by the Land Association, Griggs can nominate himself and 2 allies to that committee. At which point your creek, your well access, your irrigation rights, all of it becomes subject to committee approval. His committee. Clara was very still. That's not what it says, Clara said, though her voice had gone careful. That's what it means, Abigail said. Read the 4th paragraph again. Clara read it. Her expression changed slowly, the way a weather front changes. Subtle at first, and then unmistakable. Roy can't sign this, she said. No, and if you know of anyone else who's received it, they shouldn't either. Abigail paused. May I make a copy of this document? Clara looked at her and then nodded and got up to find paper and a pen. When Cole and Roy came back from the barn, the 2 women were sitting at the kitchen table with 2 copies of the document laid out side by side and a list of 12 names, neighbors, small ranchers, settlers, that Clara had been able to recall off the top of her head who had likely received Griggs's letter, or soon would. Cole stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. Then he looked at Abigail. She looked back. Roy, she said, without looking away from Cole. Did Griggs come to you about a water rights proposal? Roy Henderson shifted his weight. He did. Have you spoken to anyone else about it? Well, no. He said it was better handled quietly. I expect he did, Abigail said. He said that because he knows that if the ranchers in this region compare notes, they'll find he's been filing small claims and moving boundary markers and making neighborly threats to most of them for the last 3 years, and that this letter is the final piece of a plan he's been building the whole time. She picked up her copy of the document. Cole, we need to call a meeting. He walked into the kitchen and picked up Clara's copy of the document. He read it the way he read everything, carefully, without rushing, his expression giving nothing away. He got to the 3rd paragraph and she watched him stop. The committee clause, he said. Yes. He set the paper down. How many people has he gotten signatures from already? We don't know yet, Abigail said, which is why we need to move quickly. Roy Henderson sat down heavily in his kitchen chair. If he already has enough, he doesn't, Abigail said. He needs a 2/3 majority of registered landholders in the district to take this to the board. If he had that, he wouldn't still be collecting signatures quietly. He'd have filed already. How do you know that? Roy asked. I read the Land Association charter last week, she said. Cole had a copy. Cole looked at her. She saw the question in his face, when, and answered it. The night after the fence was cut. I couldn't sleep. Roy and Clara exchanged a glance across their kitchen table, the kind of glance that contained a complete conversation. Then Roy said, What kind of meeting are you talking about? Nothing formal, Abigail said. Not yet. I want to talk to Margaret Pettifer first, and the widow Hennessy. I want to understand what Griggs has said to each of them, because I'll wager the approach has been different for each one, and knowing the different angles will tell us more about what he's actually afraid of. He's not afraid of anything, Roy said. He's Harlan Griggs. He's afraid of exactly one thing, Abigail said. He's afraid that the people he's been working separately will start talking to each other. She folded her copy of the document and put it in her coat pocket. Which is why we're going to do that. They left the Hendersons' place an hour later, and Cole drove the first mile in silence. The sky had gone the color of an old bruise, heavy and close, and the wind had the smell of oncoming snow. You didn't tell me you'd read the Land Association charter, he said. You didn't ask what I was reading. Fair. He guided the horse around a frozen rut. Clara Henderson has been leery of strangers since a land agent cheated them out of 60 acres 5 years ago. She doesn't warm up to people quickly. I noticed. She made you coffee, he said. She did. She didn't make the last 3 people who came to that house coffee. Abigail looked out at the darkening land. I wasn't charming. I was just honest about what I saw. Same result, different method, Cole said. They drove on. The first light snow started falling, thin and uncertain, testing the air. Margaret Pettifer, Abigail said. You said she'll wait to judge. How did she handle the water rights case? Quietly. She didn't fight it publicly, paid the filing fee to challenge Griggs's claim, and then lost the challenge on a technicality. She never said much about it to anyone. Was the technicality legitimate? The Land Association board member who ruled on it has been seen having dinner with Griggs 4 times in the last year, Cole said. Abigail absorbed this. He has someone on the board. At least one. Maybe 2. Then the meeting we need isn't just about stopping the signatures, she said slowly. It's about building enough collective standing that when this goes to the board, the ranchers in this district can contest the ruling if it goes against them. Which means we need the territorial land office involved, not just the local association. Cole was quiet for a moment. That's a much bigger fight than I thought we were having. I know. Abigail, he said her first name for the first time, and it came out slightly rough, like something he'd been carrying in his pocket and finally put on the table. Are you sure you want to be in the middle of this? You've been here 11 days. She turned to look at him. The snow was coming faster now, settling on the brim of his hat and on the horse's dark mane, and his face in the thin afternoon light was tired and direct, and she thought, genuinely asking. You advertised for a partner, she said, not someone to stay in the kitchen while you managed it. I know what I advertised. Then you have your answer. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable and then turned back to the road. The horse moved steadily through the thickening snow. She had not told him the other things she'd noticed in Clara Henderson's kitchen, the things she'd seen when she was making the copy of Griggs's document, and her hand had steadied over the paper, and her mind had gone quiet and careful the way it did when something slid into place. The document wasn't new. The language was too precise, too carefully layered. Someone had drafted this over months, maybe longer, which meant Griggs had been planning this specific move since before the accident, since before Cole's father died. He'd been waiting for the right configuration of weakness, and when Cole came back from the logging camp with one arm and no family left on the property, Griggs had simply activated a plan he'd been sitting on for years. That changed what this was. This wasn't a bully taking advantage of misfortune. This was something colder and more patient, and it had been aimed at the Brennan Ranch specifically for a long time. She would tell Cole, just not yet. Not on a wagon in falling snow when they were still 11 days into knowing each other and the information would land badly without the right context around it. There was a right time for hard things, and this wasn't it. She filed it in the part of her mind she used for things that required the right moment and watched the snow come down. They got back to the ranch in the early dark to find Eli Pruitt waiting at the barn door with a lamp and a look on his face that meant something had happened. What? Cole said, climbing down from the wagon. Cutter Walsh came by again, Eli said. He was 16 and trying to sound matter-of-fact about it, which only amplified how much it had rattled him. About an hour ago, he brought 2 other men I didn't know. They wanted to water their horses at the trough. That's fine, Cole said. They have a right to water their horses. Yes, sir. But while the horses were drinking, one of the men walked over to the north side of the barn and started looking at the foundation. Cole went still. I came out and asked him what he needed, Eli continued, and he said he was just admiring the construction. And then Cutter Walsh said, the boy stopped, swallowed. He said to tell you that Mr. Griggs had asked him to convey that the winter's looking hard, and he hoped your structures were all in solid shape. A pause. And then he looked at me when he said it, not at the barn, at me. The snow was falling steadily now. The lamp Eli held through a small orange circle in the dark. Cole turned to look at Abigail. She had heard every word. Her face was calm, which she was making an effort to maintain because what she was feeling was not calm. It was the specific cold anger she had learned to contain during the war, the kind that came when someone with power made a threat at someone with none. They had looked at a 16-year-old boy. Eli, she said. Her voice came out steady. Did you get a look at the 2 men you didn't know? Yes, ma'am. One was big, sandy hair, scar on his chin. The other was shorter, dark coat, didn't take his hat off. Would you recognize them again? Yes, ma'am. Good. She turned to Cole. I need to add to the ledger tonight, and tomorrow I think we should visit Margaret Pettifer. Tomorrow's not tomorrow, she said. The single word was quiet, but it closed the conversation. Cole looked at her for a moment in the lamplight. Then he said, Dix, can you take the wagon? Dix Calloway materialized from somewhere behind Eli. He'd been there the whole time, she realized, standing in the barn doorway, letting the boy report, but making sure he didn't have to do it alone. Already on it, Dix said. Abigail walked toward the house. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned back. Eli Pruitt was still standing with the lamp, looking at her with the uncertain expression of a boy who had been frightened and was still deciding whether it was all right to show that. You did exactly right, she told him, coming to meet us, asking them what they needed, watching their faces, all of it. He straightened slightly. Thank you, ma'am. Get inside and get warm, she said. You can help me with something after supper. Inside, she hung her coat and stood at the kitchen table and opened the ledger to the current page. She wrote, November 14th. Cutter Walsh and 2 unidentified men, descriptions below, came to water horses. 1 man inspected North Barn Foundation without stated purpose. Walsh delivered verbal message citing concern about winter and structural integrity. Message delivered to Eli Pruitt, age 16, while maintaining eye contact with subject, interpreted as warning. She wrote down Eli's descriptions of the 2 men. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top, Things I know that I have not yet said. She wrote for a long time. Cole came in from the barn while she was still writing. He got the fire going higher without being asked because the kitchen had gone cold, and put water on to heat and sat down across from her without looking at what she was writing, which she appreciated and noted. After a while he said, My father used to say that Harlan Griggs's father was the same kind of man. Said the difference was that the father was obvious about it. And the son learned to be patient. The son learned that patience looks like courtesy. He picked up his coffee cup from this morning, realized it was cold, and set it down again. My father wouldn't sell him a single acre when he asked, 3 years before he died. Griggs Sr. took it well. Harlan must have been watching. Abigail stopped writing. Your father refused a direct purchase offer? 2 of them. The north parcel, the one with the creek that he later tried to claim water rights on. Father said the price was fair, but the buyer wasn't. Cole paused. He meant it as an insult. Griggs took it politely and remembered it. For 20 years, apparently. She looked at the page in front of her, then she looked up at him. Cole, this plan of his, the land association letter, the committee, the water rights, he didn't build this because you came back from the logging camp missing an arm. He'd already built it. You were just the moment he decided to begin. Cole was quiet for a long moment. The fire snapped. Outside, the snow was coming down properly now, covering everything. I know, he said, finally. I've known for a while. I just didn't want to say it out loud because saying it out loud makes it a different size. It's the same size either way, she said. Knowing makes it easier to fight. He looked at her across the table, and she saw in his face something she had not seen there before. Not relief exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who had been carrying something alone for too long and had just, for the first time, been able to put it down for a moment without it disappearing. Margaret Pettifer tomorrow, he said. Margaret Pettifer tomorrow, she agreed. She went back to writing. He got up and made fresh coffee and put a cup beside her without comment, and went to tend the fire, and the snow came down outside and covered the tracks Cutter Walsh and his men had left in the yard, and the ranch was quiet, and neither of them wasted what was left of the evening. Margaret Pettifer's ranch was 3 miles east, and it looked like a place that had been fighting the same battle for 2 years and winning just barely. The fences were mended, but mended hard, the kind of repairs you make when you don't have enough wire and have to splice what's left with whatever comes to hand. The barn was solid, but unpainted, the wood gone gray and dry. 2 horses in the corral were good animals, well kept, which told Abigail something about the woman who ran this place. When resources were tight, she fed the working animals first. The house itself was smaller than the Brennan ranch house, but someone had hung a dried herb bundle on the front door, and the step had been swept clean of snow that morning. Margaret Pettifer came out before they reached the porch. She was in her early 50s, angular and weathered, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of eyes that had stopped performing friendliness some time ago, and simply looked at things directly. She was wearing a coat that was too light for the temperature and had probably been too light for 2 winters running. She looked at Cole first. Cole? Margaret. He pulled up the wagon. Thank you for seeing us on short notice. Her gaze moved to Abigail with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had learned that first impressions were expensive mistakes. Mrs. Brennan, she said. Mrs. Pettifer. Abigail climbed down. I appreciate the time. I'll try not to waste it. Margaret studied her for another moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Come in, then. The inside of the house was spare and very clean, the kind of clean that comes from having reduced your possessions to only what works. A younger man, early 20s, Margaret's son by the look of the jaw, was sitting at the kitchen table with a harness spread out for repair. He looked up when they came in. My son James, Margaret said. He'll stay, if you don't mind. I prefer it, Abigail said, which seemed to surprise both of them. James Pettifer pulled the harness to one side to make room on the table and said nothing, but his posture loosened slightly. He had a quiet wariness to him that Abigail recognized, the specific alertness of a young man who had taken on weight too early and was still figuring out whether he was strong enough for it. Margaret put coffee on, and they sat, and the light came through the south window flat and white, and Abigail put her copy of Griggs's document on the table without preamble. Margaret looked at it. She didn't touch it. He brought that to me 6 weeks ago, she said. Did you sign it? No. Margaret's voice was even. I told him I needed time to review it, and he said he understood and that he hoped my winter supply situation was better than last year's. A pause. Last year, a section of my hay bales turned in storage. Mold. I lost about a third of what I'd put up. Did that happen naturally? Abigail asked. The silence in the kitchen was careful. The bales were stacked correctly, James said, from his end of the table. His voice was controlled, but there was something banked behind it. They'd been stacked correctly for 3 years running. There was no reason for them to turn. Abigail did not say what she was thinking, which was that unsupervised access to a hay storage could produce exactly that result if someone knew what they were doing and cared enough to bother. She looked at Margaret instead. When Griggs came with the document, did he come alone? He brought Cutter Walsh. Was Walsh armed? Walsh is always armed. Margaret finally picked up the document and looked at it. I've read this 3 times. I don't fully understand the committee language. You weren't meant to, Abigail said. She leaned forward and walked Margaret through the same analysis she'd given Clara Henderson the day before. The committee clause, the undefined term shared, the absence of any specification about who would hold authority. Beside her, she could feel Cole listening with his particular focused stillness, and she was aware that some of this was new to him too, the additional layers she'd found in the 3rd and 4th readings the night before. Margaret listened without interrupting. James stopped pretending to work on the harness and turned fully in his chair. When Abigail finished, Margaret set the document down and was quiet for a moment. He's going to own the water, she said. Not a question. He's going to control it, Abigail said, which is more useful than owning it. Ownership can be challenged. Control, if it's built into an association charter through a ratified document, is much harder to contest after the fact. Can it be stopped? Yes, but not by one ranch. Abigail looked at her directly. How many people do you know who've received this document? Margaret glanced at her son. Some communication passed between them that Abigail couldn't fully read. Something about who to trust and how far, the kind of calculation you make when you've already been hurt once by a wrong answer. At least 7, Margaret said, possibly more. He started with the smaller operations, the ones with less standing in the association. The ones least likely to compare notes with the larger ranchers, Abigail said. Yes. Has anyone signed it? Ed Norris signed it in September. He's got a small place north of here, 60 acres. He needed Griggs's goodwill for a shared fence line. Walt Briggs signed it too, but Walt will sign anything if you bring him a bottle of rye first and ask him while he's in a good mood. Cole said, That's 2 signatures. He needs how many, Abigail? 2/3 of registered district landholders. I counted 14 registered in the current association rolls, so he needs 10. She turned back to Margaret. He has 2 confirmed. Clara Henderson's husband hasn't signed. You haven't signed. We haven't signed. That's 4 no's. and at least 8 others we don't know yet. We don't know that those 8 are no's, James said. He had his mother's directness, less weathered. Some of them might have already signed, or be about to. That's why we need to talk to them, Abigail said. All of them. Before Griggs realizes that we're doing it. Margaret looked at Cole. You've been fighting this man on your own for 2 years. I've been documenting it, Cole said. That's different from fighting. Not anymore, Abigail said quietly. Margaret turned back to Abigail with an expression that was still not warm but had moved into something adjacent. The look of someone reassessing a calculation. What do you want from me? I want to know the name of every landholder you're on speaking terms with in this district. I want to know which ones Griggs has been working on longest and which ones might not yet have been approached. And I'd like to use your kitchen table as a meeting place in the next 2 weeks, because it's more central than the Brennan Ranch and less visible to Griggs's men, who ride our north fence line 3 times a week. James made a sound that might have been a laugh and turned it into a cough. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, James, get the map. James got up and went to a chest near the window and came back with a folded survey map of the district, the kind the land office distributed, with the property boundaries marked in faded lines. He spread it on the table over the harness and the document, and the 3 of them bent over it together while Cole held the lamp close so the light fell evenly across the paper. What came out of the next 40 minutes was not a plan exactly. It was more like the shape of a plan, the skeleton of it. Margaret knew things that Cole didn't about 3 of the smaller landholders, and Cole knew things about 2 others that Margaret hadn't been aware of, and Abigail listened to all of it and asked questions that were not rhetorical, and by the time Margaret rolled up the map, she had written 6 names in the ledger book she'd brought, and beside each one a note about the approach most likely to work and the risk most likely to get in the way. They were putting on their coats to leave when Margaret said from behind them, Mrs. Brennan. Abigail turned. The water rights case, Margaret said, when I lost the challenge. The board member who ruled against me, his name is Frederick Cale. He's been on the Land Association board for 11 years. His brother-in-law works for Griggs's operation. Abigail held her gaze. Thank you. I should have said something sooner, Margaret said. Not apologetically, just accurately. You didn't have anyone to say it to, Abigail said. Now you do. The snow from the night before had frozen hard, and the wagon moved slowly on the road back. Cole was quiet for most of the first mile in the way that had started to feel familiar. Not absence, just processing. Frederick Cale, he said eventually. Yes. If he's compromised, any challenge that goes to the board goes through him. Which means we can't let it get to the board, Abigail said. We need to take it to the Territorial Land Office directly. Over the association's head, she paused. That requires documented evidence of a pattern of fraudulent manipulation of association processes, which is exactly what the ledger is for. How much do we have documented so far? Enough to show a pattern, not enough to be definitive. She looked at the road ahead, the frozen land on either side, the flat gray sky that had been promising worse weather for a week. We need 3 more things. We need the testimonies of at least 4 landholders describing specific incidents of pressure or implied threats. We need to establish the relationship between Cale and Griggs formally, not just Margaret's word, which is credible, but which Griggs could challenge as the complaint of a woman who lost a case. And we need to find out if there are any prior complaints filed against Griggs with the territorial office that were quietly buried. How do we find that out? We need someone in Cheyenne with access to the territorial records. She thought. Is there a lawyer in Cheyenne you trust? Cole considered. There's a man named Horace Webb. He handled my father's estate. He's not a fighter. He's a documents man, careful and slow. Careful and slow is exactly what I need, Abigail said. Not someone who'll go in swinging, someone who'll read every page and find the thing that was misfiled or conveniently lost. I can send him a letter. I'll write it, she said. Tonight. Cole glanced at her. You haven't slept well in a week. I slept 4 hours last night. That's adequate. Abigail, the first name again, with the same slight roughness. Adequate isn't the same as sufficient. I know the difference, she said. I'll sleep when we have more time. He let it go, which she appreciated, though she could tell he hadn't finished with the thought. The meeting came together in Margaret Pettifer's kitchen on a Tuesday evening 10 days later, and it was not the orderly affair Abigail had hoped for. 7 people came. Roy Henderson arrived with Clara and stood at the back wall with his arms crossed, which she'd learned meant he was listening hard. Margaret's son James sat near the door. A woman named Vera Sykes, who ran a small sheep operation 2 miles north of the Pettifer Ranch, came with her adult nephew and sat with the particular tension of someone who had almost not come and was still deciding if she'd made the right call. A man named Douglas Farr, who had 40 acres on the district's western edge, arrived 20 minutes late and smelled of whiskey and anxiety, which was a difficult combination to manage. The 2 who surprised Abigail were Luther Kane and his wife Bess, who ran the second-largest cattle operation in the district after Griggs himself. Luther Kane was 60, built like a man who had spent his whole life doing physical work and was not ready to stop, with a close-cropped white beard and a reputation for bluntness that apparently covered a broad range of topics. He had not been on Abigail's list because Cole had said he was unlikely to come, that Kane and Griggs had always had a cordial relationship, and that Kane's size made him one of the few ranchers in the district Griggs treated as a peer rather than a resource. He sat down at the table and looked at Abigail and said, "My wife told me about the document. Show me." Abigail showed him. He read it twice, slowly, his thick finger moving along the lines of the 3rd paragraph. Then he said, "That son of a bitch," with calm, almost scholarly precision, and Bess Kane patted his arm without looking up from her own reading. "He brought this to you?" Abigail asked. 3 weeks ago, Luther said. "Told me the committee would be made up of the 3 largest landholders in the district by acreage. He presented it like it was a favor, like he was cutting me in." His jaw was set. "I told him I'd think about it. I didn't sign. Something felt wrong and I couldn't name it until Bess read the damn thing last week." "The committee membership isn't specified anywhere in the document," Bess said. She had a quiet, precise way of speaking that reminded Abigail slightly of herself, which was not a thought she'd expected to have. He told Luther verbally what it would look like. Verbal promises from Harlan Griggs aren't worth the air they're made of. "No," Abigail agreed. "They're not." Douglas Farr, from his chair near the window, said, "What I want to know is what happens if we don't stop him. If he gets the signatures and the board ratifies it, what does that actually mean for the rest of us?" The room went quiet. Abigail looked at Farr. He was in his mid-40s and had the look of a man who had made a series of small compromises over the years and was starting to feel their cumulative weight. "It means the committee controls access to water sources designated as shared infrastructure. It means your irrigation rights are subject to committee approval. It means if you plant a crop that requires more water than the committee decides your operation needs, you either pay a fee or you go without." "He'd charge us for our own water," Vera Sykes said. Her voice had gone flat. "In effect, yes. And if we can't pay, then you default. And a property in default on its water rights assessment is a property with reduced standing in the association, which makes it easier for a neighbor to challenge your fence lines, your boundary markers, your grazing rights." She paused. "Which Griggs has been doing to individual ranchers for years already. This document simply makes it systematic." Luther Kane said, "He's building a mechanism." "Yes." "He doesn't want to own our land," Luther said slowly. "He wants to own the thing our land needs." "Yes," Abigail said. "That's exactly it." The room was quiet for a moment with the weight of this. Cole, sitting to Abigail's left, was watching the faces in the room with the careful attention of a man who had lived among these people for years and was now seeing something shift in them. Roy Henderson uncrossed his arms. That was the first sign. "What do we do?" he asked. Abigail opened the ledger. "We start with testimony. Every person in this room who has experienced an incident, a fence cut, a boundary marker moved, a storage loss that didn't make sense, a legal claim that seemed to come from nowhere, a neighborly visit that felt like a threat. I need it written down. Dated, described, witnessed where possible." "And then what?" Farr said. "Then we build a formal complaint to the Territorial Land Office, not to the Association Board, over it. The complaint documents a pattern of fraudulent manipulation of association processes and presents evidence of a compromised board member. She paused. The association cannot police itself when the corruption is in its own governance structure. The territorial office can appoint an independent examiner. That examiner has authority, the local board doesn't. How do you know all this? Vera Sykes asked. Not aggressively, with genuine curiosity. I read the Territorial Charter on Land Association Governance, Abigail said, and I wrote to a lawyer in Cheyenne named Horace Webb who confirmed the procedure. A lawyer? Farr made a sound. Lawyers cost money. Horace Webb is reviewing the complaint document at no charge as a favor to Cole's family, Abigail said. If a formal filing becomes necessary, the cost will be shared across all parties to the complaint, which is why the more people who join the complaint, the less each individual bears. Farr was quiet. Luther Kane leaned forward. Has Griggs done anything we could call illegal outright? Not just sharp practice, actually illegal. Abigail looked at Cole. Cole said, the fence cutting, that's criminal destruction of property. We can prove it was cut? Luther asked. I documented it the day I found it, Cole said. Wire cuts clean with snips. I kept a section of the wire. Something moved through the room. A small, collective shift, like the moment when people who have been standing separately take a single step toward the same point. I've got something too, James Pettifer said, from his spot by the door. Everyone looked at him. When our hay turned last year, I didn't throw all of it out, kept 3 bales that had been treated differently from the ones that turned naturally. There was a residue on them that I couldn't identify, but that didn't come from the hay itself. He paused. I kept them because something felt wrong, and I didn't know what to do with the feeling. Margaret Pettifer looked at her son with the expression of a woman who had not known this and was recalibrating rapidly. That could be evidence of deliberate contamination, Abigail said carefully, which is a significantly more serious matter than fence cutting. She looked at James. Where are those bales? Back corner of the north storage. Don't move them. Don't mention them to anyone outside this room. She looked around at the assembled faces. Everything we discuss here stays here. Griggs has been patient for years because information is his primary tool. If he learns what we're building before we file, he has time to counter it. Douglas Farr, who had been quiet for several minutes, said in a different voice than before, he sent a man by my place last week. Said he was checking on some stray cattle. While he was there, he mentioned that my East Parcel survey from 1869 might have some irregularities and that Griggs would be happy to help me resolve them quietly. A pause. I've been lying awake about that. Was there an irregularity in the survey? Cole asked. I don't know. I couldn't afford to find out. I can look at it, Abigail said. I'm not a surveyor, but I've read enough land filings in the last 2 weeks to know what a fraudulent irregularity claim looks like versus a legitimate one, and if it's the former, I can document it as another instance of the pattern. Farr looked at her. Why would you do that for me? You don't know me. You came tonight, she said simply. That tells me enough. Cole said nothing, but she felt him shift slightly beside her, and she was aware of him in the way she'd started to become aware of him over the past weeks, as a specific presence, a specific weight in a room, someone whose silences she was beginning to read the way you learn to read the weather when you live somewhere that punishes inattention. Vera Sykes said, I want to sign the complaint, whatever you're building. I want my name on it. So do I, Luther Kane said. And ours, Roy Henderson said, glancing at Clara, who nodded once. They went around the room. Every person there said yes, with varying degrees of hesitation. Farr last, and slowly, and with the specific expression of a man stepping off a ledge. He wasn't sure was the right height, but stepping anyway. They were home by 9. The temperature had dropped sharply, the kind of cold that pressed in at the windows and made the fire necessary at its highest rather than its most efficient. And Dix had it stoked when they came in, along with a pot of something hot on the stove that turned out to be a stew. That wasn't quite right, but was warm, and Abigail ate it without comment. Eli was at the table with the ledger book, where she had set him to copying testimony summaries in his careful, slow hand. He was 16 and his handwriting was better than she'd expected, probably because no one had ever told him it should be quick. He looked up when they came in. "Done with the Henderson account and Mrs. Pettifer's," he said, "working on Mr. Brennan's fence incident." "Good," she said. "Leave space after each entry for witness signatures. We'll need those later." He nodded and bent back over the book. Cole stood at the stove and poured himself coffee and didn't say anything for a while. The house had its nighttime sounds: wood settling, wind finding the places it always found, the distant shift of animals in the barn. "Kane surprised me," he said finally. "Did he?" "I thought he was in Griggs's corner, or at least not opposed." "He wasn't in Griggs's corner," Abigail said, sitting down and pulling off her boots. Her feet were cold. "He was in his own corner. Those aren't the same thing. Griggs made the mistake of approaching him like a peer and then offering him a deal that was actually an insult. He'd be on the committee, but the committee would be controlled by Griggs. Kane is a man who spent 40 years building something real. He knows the difference between being offered a seat and being offered the appearance of one." Cole turned to look at her. "How did you know that before you met him?" "I didn't know it. I suspected it. Clara Henderson mentioned that Kane's wife was the one who handled their association filings. A man who lets his wife handle the legal paperwork either doesn't value the work or deeply values her judgment. Given what I saw of Bess Kane tonight, I assumed the latter." Cole was quiet for a moment, then, "You were right." "I've been wrong before," she said. "I'm paying attention, so I'll notice when I am." He refilled his coffee and sat down across from her, and for a moment they were just two people at a kitchen table at the end of a hard day, which was most of what marriage turned out to be in Abigail's experience. The long middle stretch between the beginning and the end, where you were just people trying to get through the days without making too many irreversible mistakes. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "That document Griggs has been circulating, I don't think he wrote it himself. The language is too precise for a man who writes the way his letters to the association board read. I compared them in the charter files you had. Someone with legal training drafted that committee clause. Someone who knew exactly which terms to leave undefined and which to specify." Cole's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "He has a lawyer. A good one. Someone who knows territorial land law and association charter structure." She looked at her hands. "Which means when we file our complaint, we need to be better prepared than I thought. Horace Webb is careful and thorough, but we may need someone with more specific experience in territorial land disputes." "Webb will know who that is," Cole said. "He knows every lawyer in the territory." "Then I need to write him a second letter tonight." "Abigail." His voice had the quality it got when he was about to say something he'd decided to say carefully. "You have been at this for 3 weeks without stopping, every night past midnight in this kitchen. You're eating less than you should. You look tired in a way that's past a night's sleep fixing." She looked at him. "I know. I'm not asking you to stop. I know that too. I'm asking you to—" He stopped, started again. "I'm asking you to tell me what you need, not what the work needs, what you need." It was a strange question, not because it was wrong, but because she couldn't immediately remember the last time someone had asked it meaning her specifically, her needs specifically, not the needs of the patient, or the household, or the cause, or the organization. She thought about it honestly. "I need the roof on the east bedroom fixed before the next heavy snow," she said, "because I've been waking up at 3 a.m, listening to the wind against that wall and calculating what it'll cost to fix the structural damage in spring if I don't fix it now, and that's the thing that's actually keeping me up." Cole stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll fix it tomorrow. The pitch is steep. You'll need someone on the roof with you. Dix has done it before." "Take Eli too," she said. "He needs to learn, and he learns faster when he's busy." Cole nodded. She got up and went to the writing desk and pulled out paper. "Go to bed," she said. "I'll write the letter to Webb and be up in an hour." He got up. He paused near the table on his way to the hallway door. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight. For all of it." She was already writing, but she heard the quality in his voice, the specific weight a man uses when he means something in excess of the words. "Get some sleep," she said. "The roof will be cold work tomorrow." He went. Eli finished the last entry and brought the ledger to her desk, and she checked his work, which was good, better than good. And she told him so, and sent him to bed, and sat alone at the desk while the fire burned lower and wrote 2 letters and added 4 pages to the ledger and finally stopped when her handwriting started to go loose and uncertain, which was her body's reliable signal that the night was done. She sat for a moment before she went to bed, her hands flat on the desk, the house quiet around her, and thought about the faces in Margaret Pettifer's kitchen, the fear in some of them, the anger in others, the particular look on Luther Kane's face when he said he wants to own the thing our land needs, and the room understood all at once what they were actually dealing with. She thought about the hay bales in Margaret Pettifer's north storage, about the section of cut wire Cole had kept in the barn, about Frederick Cale and his brother-in-law and 11 years on the Land Association board. She thought about the unknown lawyer who had drafted that committee clause, sitting somewhere in the territory right now, probably confident that the document was airtight. She hoped he was wrong. She was going to find out. Horace Webb's reply came on a Friday, 12 days after Abigail sent the second letter, and it arrived with a second envelope tucked inside the first. Webb's own letter was 3 pages, written in the careful, dense hand of a man who had been trained to say precisely what he meant and nothing beyond it. He confirmed that the committee clause in Griggs's document was, as Abigail had suspected, deliberately ambiguous in ways that would not survive a challenge in territorial court, but would absolutely survive a ratification vote by a local association board whose members lacked legal training. He confirmed that the procedure for filing a complaint with the Territorial Land Office was exactly as Abigail had outlined, and then he wrote 1 paragraph that she read twice before she looked up. "I have made some discreet inquiries regarding prior complaints filed against landholders in your district. I am not at liberty to say how I obtained the following information, but I can tell you that in March of 1871 and again in September of 1872, complaints were filed with the Territorial Office regarding boundary manipulation and water rights interference in Cheyenne District. Both complaints were formally received and then marked as resolved without examination. The name of the territorial officer who processed both resolutions is Edmund Rafe. Mr. Rafe retired from the office in early 1873 and currently operates a land brokerage in Denver. I leave the implications to your judgment." The second envelope was from a lawyer named Sylvester Coombs, whom Webb had described in his letter as the most capable territorial land law practitioner in Wyoming, a difficult man to work with, and the right one for this situation. Coombs's letter was 1 page and almost insultingly brief. It said he had reviewed Webb's summary of the situation, that the complaint, as Abigail had constructed it, was structurally sound but would require sworn affidavits rather than written summaries, that he would be available to meet in Cheyenne on the 14th of January, and that his fee was $40 for the initial consultation. $40. She set the letters down and looked at the kitchen ceiling for a moment, running the numbers she already knew by heart. The ranch's operating margin through winter, the repair costs she had already scheduled, what she had brought with her from St. Louis, which was not much but was something. Cole came in from the morning chores while she was still looking at the ceiling and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" She handed him Webb's letter. He read it standing at the kitchen door, still in his coat, the cold coming off him in the particular way it did on sharp mornings, a clean animal cold that she had stopped noticing sometime in December. She watched his face as he reached the paragraph about Edmund Rafe. "He buried 2 complaints," Cole said, "and then retired and moved to Denver." She picked up Coombs' letter and held it out. "Webb found us a lawyer." Cole read Coombs' letter. He was quiet for a moment. $40 for a meeting. "Yes." "And more after that." "Yes." She met his eyes. "I have $32 that I brought from St. Louis. Clara Henderson mentioned that Roy has been putting money aside because he didn't trust Griggs and wanted options. Luther Kane is not a man who comes to a fight without resources. Between the 7 people who committed to the complaint, $40 is manageable. You've already thought about how to split it." "I thought about it at 3 in the morning, she said, "which is when I think about things I don't want to think about at dinner." Cole folded both letters and put them on the table. He pulled off his coat and hung it, and poured himself coffee and stood at the stove with his back to her for a moment, in a way she had learned did not mean he was shutting her out, but meant he was deciding something. "The 14th of January," he said. 3 weeks. We need the affidavits before then. "I know. I want to go back to Margaret's this week and start taking them formally. Coombs will want them signed and witnessed." She paused. "I also want to talk to Vera Sykes alone, without the group. She knows something she didn't say in the meeting. I could see it." Cole turned around. "What makes you think that?" She flinched when James mentioned the hay bales. Not when he said what they were, when he said he'd kept them. The flinch was recognition, not surprise. Abigail wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup. Something happened to her that's similar, and she didn't speak up in the room because she hadn't decided yet whether she trusted the room. Cole looked at her. "You notice things." "I've spent 30 years in rooms where people were afraid to say what they knew," she said. "You learn to see around the edges of what people say." He sat down across from her. "All right, Vera Sykes. When?" "Tomorrow, if the road's passable. I'll go alone." "Abigail, a group visit confirms she was at the meeting, which she may not want known yet. One woman coming to call is ordinary." She held his gaze. "I'll be fine." He looked like he had more to say about that, and decided against it, which she respected. They were both learning the particular geography of when to push and when to leave a thing alone, and Cole was better at learning it than she'd expected from a man who had lived alone for 3 years. The east bedroom roof had been fixed the week before. She had woken the morning after the repair to silence from that corner of the house for the first time since she'd arrived, and had lain still in bed for a few minutes, experiencing the specific relief of a problem solved before it became catastrophic. She had not said anything to Cole about how much it helped. She didn't think she needed to. Vera Sykes received her the next morning with the wariness of a woman who had been burned before and rebuilt carefully and was not eager to test the reconstruction. Her sheep operation was smaller than she'd expected. 40 animals, well-tended, in a barn that was better insulated than the house. Vera herself was in her early 40s, compact and deliberate in her movements, with the specific self-sufficiency of a woman who had been alone for a long time and organized her life to require as little from others as possible. She made tea because she didn't have coffee and said so without apology, and they sat at a table that had a Bible on one end and a ledger book on the other, and Vera looked at Abigail's hands around the teacup and then at her face. "You came alone," Vera said. "Yes." "The others don't know you're here." "Cole knows, no one else." Vera nodded slowly. "When James Pettifer talked about the hay bales," she said, and stopped. "Take your time," Abigail said. Vera looked at the ledger on the end of her table. It was the same territorial issue type as the one Abigail had been using. 2 years ago, she said, before the water rights case, before Griggs started the fence business with Cole. He came to me himself, not Cutter Walsh, him personally. He was very pleasant. He said he'd noticed I was running the operation alone and that the association's rules around female-held properties were somewhat complicated, and he'd be happy to help me navigate them. She paused. I didn't know what he meant at the time. I thanked him and said I was managing. He said he was glad to hear it and that he'd look in on me again. And then? That winter I lost 11 sheep. I found them on 3 separate mornings, just dead. No obvious cause. The ground was too frozen to examine them properly, and by spring there was nothing left to examine. She was looking at the table. I filed a loss report with the association. Standard procedure for insurance purposes. The report came back 3 weeks later with a notation that my operations insurance assessment had been recategorized due to, quote, inadequate demonstrated capacity to prevent livestock loss in conditions of environmental stress. Abigail was very still. Your insurance premium went up, she said. Doubled, Vera said, and my association standing was formally noted as provisional, which I later found out means that if I miss a single assessment payment, my membership can be suspended without hearing. Who authorized that recategorization? The form had 2 signatures. One was Frederick Cale. Vera looked up. The other was a name I didn't recognize, initials only, E.R. Edmund Rafe, 2 years before he retired. Abigail kept her face still. Did you keep the form? Vera stood up without answering and went to a box near the window. the kind of wooden box that a careful person uses to store things that matter when they have no filing cabinet. She came back with a piece of paper that had been folded and refolded until the creases were soft, and put it on the table between them. Abigail looked at it. The signatures were exactly as Vera had described. Frederick Cale's name in a flowing hand, and beneath it the initials ER in a different, smaller script. "Vera," Abigail said carefully, "this is very important. Would you be willing to provide a sworn affidavit about the sheep and about this document to a lawyer named Sylvester Coombs, who will be in Cheyenne on the 14th of January?" Vera looked at her for a long time. Outside, the sheep moved in the barn, their small sounds muffled by the walls. "If I sign something," Vera said, "and Griggs finds out before anything's resolved." "I know," Abigail said. "I know what you're risking." "I can't lose this operation," Vera said. Her voice stayed level, but there was something behind it that was not level at all. "My nephew is here now, but he's young, and he has nowhere else either. I can't—" She stopped. "You have until the 14th to decide," Abigail said. "I won't push you, but I want you to understand what we're building and what it means if it succeeds." She leaned forward slightly. "If the Territorial Land Office appoints an independent examiner, they will review every complaint filed by every rancher in this district for the past 5 years, every inflated insurance recategorization, every suspicious livestock loss, every fence line dispute, every water rights challenge. And if they find a pattern, which we now have documented evidence of a pattern, they have the authority to reverse those decisions, including yours." Vera's hands were flat on the table. "Your provisional standing," Abigail said. "Your doubled premium. If this works, those could be reversed." Vera was quiet for a long time. "Can I keep the copy of the form?" she asked. "That's your document," Abigail said. "I'd like to make a copy to add to our complaint file with your permission. The original stays with you." Vera nodded. She got up again and brought paper and a pen, and Abigail copied the form exactly, signatures and all, and dated the copy and noted at the bottom that it was a true copy of the original held by Vera Sykes, and signed her own name as copier. When she left an hour later, Vera came to the door and said, "The sheep that died. I think I know what happened to them. I just couldn't prove it, and I was afraid that saying it out loud would make Griggs think I was a problem." Abigail turned on the step. The cold was sharp, and the sky was the hard white of a day that intended to stay cold. "You are a problem," Abigail said. "For him. That's the right thing to be." Something moved through Vera Sykes's face that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to count. Abigail drove back through the frozen afternoon with the copy of the form in her coat pocket, and the specific feeling she'd learned to identify in hospital work. The moment when scattered symptoms revealed themselves as a single illness with a single cause. Everything connected to everything else. Edmund Rafe and Frederick Cale and Cutter Walsh and the cut fence wire and the hay bales and 11 dead sheep and 2 buried complaints and a document with a committee clause no honest lawyer would draft. And at the center of it all, a man who had been building this for 20 years because a dead man had called him a bad buyer. Harlan Griggs had not started this because Cole Brennan came home with one arm. He had started it because Cole's father had seen him clearly. She thought about that for the rest of the drive. The weeks between Vera's visit and the Cheyenne meeting were the hardest of what Abigail would later think of as the working winter. Not because things went wrong exactly, but because things went slow, which at that stage of the fight felt almost worse. She and Cole drove to Margaret Pettifer's 3 times to take affidavits. The process was slower than she'd hoped because people were not lawyers and could not be expected to narrate events in the organized, dated, specific language an affidavit required. And Abigail found herself functioning as a translator between what people remembered and what would be useful on a legal document, asking the same question 7 different ways until she got the version that was both accurate and precise. Cole was present for most of the sessions and said almost nothing during them, but she had noticed that his presence changed the room in a useful way. People who might have minimized their experiences in front of a stranger seemed to find it easier to be specific when Cole was there, as though his own documented losses over 2 years gave them permission to describe their own. She thought about that. The affidavits they ultimately gathered were 7 in total. Cole's fence incident, Margaret's water rights case with the Kale connection, James's hay bales, Roy Henderson's boundary marker disputes, Claire Henderson's account of the implied threat to their barn, Luther Kane's account of Griggs's offer and the verbal promises that contradicted the written document, and Vera Sykes's sheep loss and insurance recategorization. Vera had come to Margaret's kitchen on the second visit, quietly, without her nephew, and had sat at the end of the table and given her account in the same careful, leveled voice she used for everything. And when Abigail read back what she'd written to confirm accuracy, Vera had said yes to each item without flinching. Douglas Farr did not provide an affidavit. He came to one more meeting and then sent a note saying he had decided to handle his situation differently. Abigail had expected this and did not pursue him. A reluctant witness was a liability. The night before the Cheyenne meeting, Cole sat at the kitchen table while Abigail organized the complaint documents into the order Coombs had specified in his follow-up letter. The cover statement, the affidavits in chronological order of incident, the copy of Griggs's document with her written analysis, the correspondence establishing Frederick Cale's relationship to Griggs's brother-in-law, the copy of Vera's insurance form with the dual signatures, and Webb's letter regarding Edmund Rafe, which Coombs had said should be treated as background information rather than formal evidence, but would be relevant to the examiner's investigation. Cole watched her work for a while. Then he said, "When I placed that advertisement, I wrote 4 drafts." She looked up from the documents. "The first 3 kept apologizing," he said, "for the arm, for the ranch being rough, for not being what I thought someone would want." He turned his coffee cup on the table. "Dix told me to throw those drafts in the stove. He said if I was apologizing before anyone even met me, I was starting the wrong way." "He was right," Abigail said. "The version I sent was the first time in 3 years I'd described myself without apologizing for what I wasn't." He paused. "I almost didn't send it. I thought it would sound—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Honest?" she said. He looked at her. "Arrogant. Like I was pretending to be fine with something I wasn't fine with." "Are you fine with it?" A long pause. "I'm used to it," he said. "That's different." "Yes," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the temperature had dropped again, the kind of drop that came before the real winter storms, the ones that lasted 3 days and left the roads buried. She had been watching the sky since afternoon. "You wrote back one sentence that mattered," he said. "The rest of your letter was practical, but that one sentence, 'I don't mistake scars for weakness,'" she said. "I read it probably 15 times," he said. "I kept trying to figure out if you meant it or if you were just saying what you thought I wanted to hear." "I meant it. I know that now." He turned the coffee cup again. "I knew it the day you walked past Harlan Griggs's men at the station without looking at them." She set down the pen. "You saw that." "I was watching for you. I saw the whole thing." He met her eyes across the table. "I thought, this woman is either very brave or she's decided something and the decision is final. And either way, I'm glad she's here." Abigail held his gaze for a moment. "I'd decided," she said, "on the train. I spent 3 days deciding, and by the time I stepped off, I was done deciding." "What did you decide exactly?" "That if I was going to do this, I was going to do it fully, not with one foot still pointed toward the door." She picked up the pen again. "I've spent enough of my life doing things halfway because I wasn't sure they'd work. I'm too old for that." Cole was quiet. "That's not—" he started. "I know it's not romantic," she said. "I wasn't going to say that." He looked at his coffee. "I was going to say that's the thing I'm most grateful for, that you decided, that you came in all the way." A pause. "Most people don't." She looked at him across the documents and the lamp and the organized evidence of 4 months of careful, grinding work, and thought that there was more than one kind of arrival, and that some of them happened slowly, in kitchens, over account books and cold coffee, and mattered just as much as the ones that happened on train platforms. She went back to organizing the documents. "Get some sleep," she said. "The road to Cheyenne will be hard tomorrow." He got up. He paused at the hallway door the way he sometimes did, as though there was a last thing he was deciding whether to say. This time he said it. "Abigail, Whatever happens with Coombs tomorrow, whatever the outcome is, what you've done here, what you built with these people. He stopped. Started again with the bluntness that was his truest register. I could not have done this alone. And I don't say that because of the arm. I say it because you saw things I didn't see and you knew how to reach people I didn't know how to reach, and you built something in 4 months that I had been trying to build for 2 years without knowing that's what I was trying to do. He held the door frame with his right hand. I wanted to say that before tomorrow, in case tomorrow is complicated. She looked up at him. Thank you, she said, simply, without decoration. He nodded and went to bed. She sat alone at the kitchen table for a while after that, the documents in their careful order in front of her, the lamp burning steady. Eli had long since gone to bed. Dix's light in the bunkhouse was out. The ranch was quiet the way it got at midnight, settled into itself. She thought about what Cole had said, about the 4 months, about what had been built in them, not just the complaint, not just the alliance of 7 ranchers, but the daily accumulation of small competencies and shared work, and honest conversation, and 2 people learning the specific contours of each other's habits without having to make a ceremony of it. She had not expected this. She had expected a practical arrangement and had gotten one, and inside the practical arrangement something else had grown, the way plants grew in poor soil, slowly, without announcing themselves, putting down roots in the available spaces. She was not going to romanticize it. It was still new and fragile, and they still had difficult mornings and moments when the silences went the wrong kind of long, and a whole winter ahead of testing what held and what didn't. But it was real, and it was hers, and she intended to keep it. She finished the documents, checked the order twice, put them in the leather satchel she'd brought from St. Louis, and went to bed. The road to Cheyenne the next morning was exactly as hard as she'd expected. The temperature had not come up, and the frozen ruts were brutal, and the horse labored in the cold. Cole drove with his right hand and kept his pace even, and didn't complain about the conditions, which she had come to understand was his standard operating mode. Not stoicism exactly, but a preference for dealing with the thing in front of him over narrating it. They reached Cheyenne just past 10 and found Sylvester Coombs in Webb's office, which was where he'd said he'd be. He was younger than she'd anticipated, mid-40s, sharp-faced, with the particular energy of a man who was always slightly impatient with the pace at which the world moved. He shook Cole's hand and then Abigail's and said, "Mrs. Brennan, Webb tells me you put this complaint together yourself." "With help from the people it concerns," she said. He had already opened the satchel. He read the cover statement in under 2 minutes and then began moving through the affidavits with a speed that initially concerned her. And then, as she watched his eyes track the pages, seemed to be genuine processing rather than skimming. He got to the insurance form with the dual signatures. He stopped. "ER," he said. "Edmund Rafe," she said. "Webb's letter is at the back." He went to it, read it, went back to the form. He was quiet for a long moment. "This document connects a former territorial officer to a local land board member in a joint action against an individual landholder," he said slowly. "Prior to the 2 complaints he marked, resolved without examination." "Yes," she said, "if I can subpoena Rafe's records from the Denver land office." He stopped, looked at her. "How did you know to look for prior complaints?" "Because a plan this structured doesn't start new," she said. "It builds on what came before. Griggs has been doing this for 20 years. He had to have done it to someone before the people in this room." Coombs looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man upgrading his assessment. "I'm going to file an emergency petition to the Territorial Land Office for investigative jurisdiction," he said. "Not a standard complaint. A petition that cites the compromised board member and the Rafe connection as grounds for bypassing the local association process entirely." He paused. "That's a more aggressive move than a standard complaint. It will get Griggs's attention faster." "How much faster?" Cole asked. "He'll know within a week of filing," Coombs said. "He'll know someone got to the territorial level, and he'll know the local board can't protect him from an independent examiner." He looked at them both. "That's when he'll get dangerous. Not legally dangerous, personally dangerous. Are you prepared for that?" Cole said, "He's already sent men to our property to threaten a 16-year-old boy." Coombs looked at him. Then you know what you're dealing with, Coombs said. We've known since October, Abigail said. Coombs picked up the affidavit file. I'll need 3 days to draft the petition. I'll send you a copy by post before I file so you can review it. He looked at the document stack. This is good work, Mrs. Brennan, organized and specific. You've made my job considerably easier. She accepted the assessment without false modesty. What happens after you file? The territorial office appoints an examiner. The examiner reviews the complaint and has the authority to subpoena records and compel testimony. The process takes 60 to 90 days in normal circumstances. He paused. These are not normal circumstances given the Rafe connection. That may accelerate things. They left Webb's office at noon with a handshake and a receipt for the consultation fee, which they had split 6 ways and which Luther Kane had paid the largest share of without being asked and without making anything of it. On the road home, the sky had changed. Not lower exactly, but different. The particular flat white that preceded serious weather. Abigail had been watching it all morning. Storm coming? Cole said. Yes. She looked at it. How long before it arrives? Day. Maybe 2. They drove in silence for a while, the horse working steadily on the frozen road. She was thinking about Coombs' warning. That's when he'll get dangerous, and about everything they had documented, everything that was now in Coombs' hands, and about the 7 people who had put their names on affidavits and were now exposed in ways they hadn't fully been before. She was thinking about Eli Pruitt, 16 years old, standing in a barn door with a lamp. When we get home, she said, I want to move the ledger copies to somewhere other than the house. Cole glanced at her. You think he'd... I think we just went over his head to the territorial level, and Coombs told us he'd know within a week. I think the ledger and the affidavit copies and the Rafe documentation need to be somewhere that isn't the first place a person would look. She kept her eyes on the road. Is there somewhere on the property? Cole thought for a moment. Root cellar has a false floor, he said. My father built it. Nobody knows about it but Dix. Now I know about it, she said. Now you know about it, he agreed. The horse moved on. The sky pressed lower, and 2 days before the storm that would change everything in ways none of them had planned for, they drove home through the cold Wyoming afternoon with the work done and the danger sharpened and the future entirely uncertain, which was, Abigail had long since learned, the only honest way a future ever presented itself. The storm arrived on a Thursday. It did not arrive the way the smaller storms had, with a few hours of warning, a gradual thickening of the sky, enough time to bring in the animals and bank the fires and prepare. This one came down from the north in the middle of the night, like something that had been holding itself back and had finally stopped bothering. Abigail woke at 2 a.m. to a sound she had never heard before, a sustained low roar that was not wind exactly, but was wind combined with every loose thing in the territory being driven sideways at once, and by the time she got to the window she could not see the barn. She dressed in the dark. Cole was already up. How bad? She asked. He was pulling on his coat with the practiced speed of a man who had done it thousands of times in bad conditions. Bad, he said, which from Cole meant very bad. Ramon's already in the barn. He sleeps there when he thinks something's coming. Dix and Eli are... A knock at the back door. Both of them turned. Dix came in with snow on every surface of him, his beard caked white, and said, We've got a problem bigger than the ranch. He meant the train station. Abigail had not thought of the train station, but the moment Dix said it, she understood. The Cheyenne station sat at the junction of 3 roads, and in a storm of this scale, travelers caught on those roads would head for the nearest lit building with walls. The station agent was a man named Purvis, 60 years old and alone on duty, with a waiting room built for 8 people and a wood stove built for that waiting room. How many people could be out there? Cole asked. There was an eastbound train that stopped in Cheyenne yesterday afternoon, Dix said. Track crew saw the weather coming and held it there. That's maybe 40 passengers plus crew, all sitting at the station or in the hotel. But the hotel's full. I heard from Ramon, who heard it from the livery man yesterday. Some cattle buyers came through and took every room. He paused. And there's the road traffic. Anyone who was moving yesterday when the sky changed. Cole was already tightening his coat. We need to go. The road's not... Dick started. I know what the road is, Cole said. Abigail had been standing at the kitchen table. She picked up her coat. She picked up the medical bag she had kept packed since the first week. Habit from 30 years, from the understanding that emergencies do not announce themselves at convenient times. Cole turned and saw the bag in her hand. He looked at her face. "I'm not staying here," she said. He didn't argue. That was one of the things she had come to count on. He had learned over 4 months that certain statements from her were not requests for permission, but notifications of intent, and he had learned to tell the difference. They went out into it. The cold was a physical thing, not a temperature but a pressure, something that pushed against the chest and made breathing a conscious effort. The snow was horizontal, driven so hard it felt like grit, and within 30 seconds of leaving the door, Abigail's face was numb. She kept one hand on the rope Dix had strung between the house and the barn that morning in anticipation, and the rope was the only reason she knew which direction she was walking. Ramon had the horses ready. He had done it alone in the dark barn, which Abigail filed away as another piece of information about Ramon Torres that confirmed her initial assessment. He was the kind of man who did what needed to be done before anyone asked, not because he was eager to be noticed, but because he genuinely could not do otherwise. Cole rode ahead with Dix. Abigail rode with Eli, who had appeared from the bunkhouse without being summoned and was wearing 2 coats and an expression of concentrated determination that made him look older than 16 by 10 years. "You don't have to come," she told him at the barn door. "I know," he said, and mounted. The road to the station was 2 miles and took 40 minutes in conditions where Abigail could not see more than 10 feet in any direction. She trusted the horse. The horse had better sense than to walk into a ditch and knew the road better than she did, and so she gave it the reins and concentrated on staying in the saddle and watching for the lights. The station lights appeared as a faint orange smear in the white, and then resolved slowly into windows, and then they were there. What she found inside was exactly what she'd feared and slightly worse. The waiting room held perhaps 30 people, passengers from the delayed train, a family of settlers who had been on the road in a wagon and whose wagon was now somewhere in the dark outside, 2 railroad workers with frostbite beginning on their hands, an elderly man who had been sitting against the far wall when they came in and did not respond when she spoke to him, and Purvis the station agent, who was managing with the specific competence of a man who had accepted that this was beyond him and was doing what he could anyway. There were also 9 people who had not yet arrived but were coming. A railroad man named Cates told her this while she was examining the elderly man. There was another group, 6 passengers and 3 crew members who had been walking from a stopped point a mile down the track. They had sent a man ahead to find help. That man was Cates. The others were still out there. Cole heard this from across the room. He turned to Dix without speaking, and Dix was already moving toward the door. "I need someone who knows the track line east," Cole said to Cates. "I know it," Cates said. "Then you're coming with us." Abigail said without looking up from the elderly man, "Cole, his hands." Cole looked at the frostbite on Cates's hands. A pause. Then he looked at the 2 railroad workers nearby. "Either of you know the east track?" One of them said yes. "Let's go," Cole said, and went back out into it. She did not watch him leave. She had work. The elderly man was her first serious concern. He was conscious but not fully present, his skin dry and very cold, his pulse slow. Hypothermia in an older person moved faster and settled deeper and left less margin. She got 2 of the settler women to help her move him closer to the wood stove and wrapped him in every blanket she could find, and talked to him steadily while she worked, not because she thought he could fully hear her, but because the sound of a calm voice did something to a frightened body that she had observed over 30 years and could not fully explain and had long since stopped needing to. The settler family's youngest child was crying with the specific high exhausted cry of a child who has been afraid for too long and is no longer crying about a specific thing, but about everything at once. Abigail looked around and found Eli Pruitt standing near the door, looking uncertain about where to put himself. "Eli," she said, "that child needs someone to sit with her, not to fix anything. Just sit." He looked at the crying child. He was 16 and probably frightened himself and had no experience with small children, but he crossed the room and sat down on the floor next to the little girl and said, "Hey." I'm Eli. What's your name? In a voice that was a fair approximation of calm, and within 10 minutes the child had stopped crying and was telling him about her family's wagon horse in the detailed, circling way of a 4-year-old, and Eli was listening with what appeared to be genuine interest. Abigail moved through the room. The frostbite cases needed warming, done slowly. She explained this twice, firmly, to people who wanted to rub the affected hands and feet, which would damage tissue already on the edge. She reorganized the wood stove arrangement to heat the room more evenly. She found Purvis's supply cabinet and took stock. A small medical kit with basic supplies, enough for minor cases, and a reserve of hard biscuits and dried beef that was the station's emergency supply and that she immediately distributed to the children and the elderly man and the 2 women who looked thinnest, overriding Purvis's hesitation with a look that settled the matter. The settled family's father, a large man named Gebhardt, who had the dazed expression of someone whose plan had catastrophically failed, came to her after an hour and said, "Is there anything I can do?" "Yes," she said. "There are people in this room who are sitting alone being afraid. Go talk to them. It doesn't matter what you say. Just talk." He looked at her. He had probably not expected that to be the answer. "You want me to just talk to people?" "Fear is worse when you're alone with it," she said. "You survived getting your family here in that storm. That makes you someone worth talking to." He went. She watched him cross the room and sit down next to an elderly woman traveling alone and begin talking, and the woman's posture changed within a few minutes, and Abigail turned back to her work. Cole came back an hour and 40 minutes later with the 9 people from the track, all of them present and suffering from cold in various degrees but present. He came through the door sideways against the wind, and behind him came Dix and the railroad worker and Kate's, who had gone after all, his frostbitten hands wrapped in Dix's spare shirt, and 9 cold, exhausted, alive people who stood in the doorway of the waiting room and looked at the organized warmth inside with the expression of people who had stopped believing in it and were revising. Cole's face was white with cold except for 2 spots of red high on each cheek, and his right hand when she took it to check was very cold, but not dangerously so. She held it between both of her hands for a moment without saying anything. "Everyone?" she asked. "Everyone," he said. "Sit down," she said. "By the stove. Don't argue with me." He sat. She got him something hot. Purvis had found a can of coffee somewhere and had it heating. And while he drank it, she checked his hand properly, and then checked Dix, who was fine, and then the 9 people who had come in from the track, moving through them systematically, asking questions, making assessments, directing 2 of the settler men who had offered to help toward the cases that needed extra blankets or warming assistance. The storm did not stop that night. It ran through Friday and into Saturday, and the station became, through no one's formal decision, a functioning emergency shelter. Abigail organized it the way she had organized field hospitals, by need, not by order of arrival. The sickest got the warmest spots. The healthiest got tasks. The children got Eli, who turned out to have a gift for it that neither he nor anyone else had previously known about, keeping them occupied and calm through 2 days with stories he invented on the spot and a game involving pebbles from the station floor that had no fixed rules and somehow kept 5 children engaged for hours. The railroad crew contributed their supplies. The settler families shared what they had. A cattle buyer who had initially seemed like he might be difficult turned out to have medical experience from Army service and became Abigail's most useful assistant, handling 3 of the more serious frostbite cases with a competence that let her focus on the hypothermic elderly man, whose name she had finally learned was August Ferris, 71 years old, retired schoolteacher, traveling alone to see a daughter in the East. August Ferris was her hardest case. He stabilized through Friday and then declined again on Friday night, and she sat with him from midnight to 4 in the morning, adjusting the warming, talking to him when he surfaced, monitoring his pulse with her fingers against his wrist, and counting in the particular focused silence of a person for whom this kind of attention was not a performance but a practice. She had lost patience before. She had sat this exact vigil before. She knew what it looked like when it was going to go the wrong way, and she knew what it looked like when it wasn't. And at 4 in the morning on Saturday, she allowed herself to believe it was not going the wrong way, and August Ferris's pulse came up and steadied, and at 6 o'clock on Saturday morning he opened his eyes and said, clearly and rationally, "Is there any coffee?" There was. Cole appeared at her elbow while she was helping Ferris drink it. She had not heard him come up behind her, and it was a mark of how tired she was that she had not heard him at all. He looked at Ferris, he looked at her. "You've been up all night," he said. "Yes." "The storm's breaking," he said. "Sky's changing in the west." She looked at the window where the gray-white was indeed beginning to differentiate into something less uniform. Clouds with edges, light with direction. "Another few hours," she said. "Probably." He stood beside her for a moment, looking at the room. The 40-plus people distributed through the waiting room in their improvised arrangements, asleep or quietly talking or watching the windows for the weather change. Gebhardt the settler was still making rounds, talking to people, and had long since run out of things to say and was just sitting with whoever looked like they needed company, which was its own kind of competence. Eli was asleep on the floor with two of the children using his legs as a pillow. "These people," Cole said quietly, "half of them. When they came in, they were past it." "I know." "You put them back together." "They put themselves back together," she said. "I just organized the room." He looked at her in the way he sometimes did when he thought she was being falsely modest, which she wasn't, but she also understood that the distinction she was making was finer than the situation required. The storm broke fully by noon on Saturday, and the process of digging out and accounting and beginning to move again took the rest of the day. The railroad crew sent men down the track to assess damage. The settler family found their wagon mostly intact under a drift. August Ferris was well enough to sit up and eat and tell a long, funny story about a similar storm he'd survived in 1851 that had most of the room listening by the end of it. When people began to leave, several of them came to find Abigail. Some of them shook her hand. Some of them said things she would not remember specifically, but that had a common quality, a recognition of something she could not have named precisely, but understood as being about having been seen and attended to during a frightening time by someone who knew what she was doing. The cattle buyer who had helped with the frostbite cases said, "You should have a proper medical facility out here." "I know," she said. "You'd run it." "Someone would have to." He looked at her. "I'm on the Territorial Development Board. I'll remember this." She did not know what to do with that, so she said thank you and went back to work. Harlan Griggs came to find them on the Monday after the storm. Abigail had expected something, though she hadn't known its shape. Coombs had filed the emergency petition on the Friday before the storm. She'd received confirmation by courier that Thursday, the same day the storm began. Griggs would know, or would know soon, and knowing would make him move. She had thought it would be legal pressure, another set of filings, perhaps a counter-petition through his lawyer. She had not expected him to come to the ranch himself. He arrived mid-morning, alone, without Cutter Walsh, which was either a sign of confidence or a calculated gesture meant to appear as one. He was a large man, which she had known from descriptions, but which landed differently in person. Broad-shouldered, well-dressed for the territory, with a red beard that was starting to go gray at the edges, and pale eyes that were not stupid. She had always known he was not stupid. Stupid men didn't build 20-year plans. Cole came out of the barn when he heard the horse. Abigail came out of the house. They stood in the yard together, which she understood was the right configuration. Not Cole alone, not Abigail alone, both of them visible and together. Griggs stopped his horse and looked at them and produced a smile that had been constructed for situations like this. "Morning, Cole. Mrs. Brennan?" A pause that was timed with some care. "Heard you had quite a time at the station." "We managed," Cole said. "People are talking about it all over the territory," Griggs said. "Quite a thing you did." He looked at Abigail with the pale eyes that were assessing her even while the smile was running its performance. "Mrs. Brennan, remarkable what I'm hearing. You're quite an addition to this community." "Thank you," she said, pleasantly, giving nothing. "I came to talk," Griggs said. He looked at Cole. "Neighbor to neighbor." "Get down then," Cole said. Griggs dismounted and they went inside, and Abigail made coffee because making coffee gave her something to do with her hands while she listened, and because it also, she had learned, made people talk more than they intended to. There was something about a cup in the hands that made people fill silences. Griggs took his cup and looked around the kitchen with the professional appraisal of a man calculating the value of things. His eyes went to the writing desk where the second copy of the ledger sat. The copy, not the original, which was in the root cellar under the false floor, along with the affidavit copies and the Rafe documentation. I'm going to be direct, Griggs said. Please, Cole said. I understand a complaint has been filed with the Territorial Land Office. He said it evenly, without accusation, as though they were discussing weather. I want you to know that I have considerable respect for people who use proper channels. And I want to tell you, neighbor to neighbor, that I think there may have been some misunderstandings about my proposals that a conversation could resolve. Cole said nothing. The water management document, Griggs continued, was intended as a cooperative arrangement for the benefit of all landholders in the district. I think Mrs. Brennan, coming from the east, may have read some of the legal language in a way that— Mr. Griggs, Abigail said. She poured her own coffee and sat down across from him. I want to make sure I understand what you're offering. Are you suggesting that if we withdraw the territorial complaint, you'll modify the water management document? He looked at her. The smile adjusted slightly. I'm suggesting that there's room for a conversation before this becomes something that damages everyone's standing in the district. Including yours, she said. A pause. These things tend to be complicated. They are, she agreed. For instance, it's complicated when a territorial land officer processes 2 complaints as resolved without examination and then retires to Denver. That kind of complication tends to interest territorial investigators significantly. The smile stopped working entirely. She watched his face reorganize itself into something more honest, which was less pleasant but more real. He was calculating. She could see it, what she knew and what she could prove and what the gap between those things was. He was a man who had spent 20 years exploiting that gap, and he was trying to determine if it still existed. Whatever you think you've found, he started. We've found enough, Cole said. His voice was level, not angry, something quieter than anger and harder to dismiss. The petition to the territorial office is filed, and it's not being withdrawn. The independent examiner will review every complaint in this district for the past 5 years, every boundary claim, every water rights filing, every insurance recategorization. He paused. If everything you've done is above board, you have nothing to worry about. Griggs looked at him for a long moment. Cole, he said, and for the first time the pleasantness was entirely gone, and the voice underneath was different. Not loud, not threatening, just stripped of the courtesy that had been its permanent costume. Your father made an enemy of my family for 30 years over 60 acres in a handshake deal. I have been patient with this property in a way he never deserved, and you have never appreciated. I know exactly how patient you've been, Cole said. I have it documented. Griggs set down his coffee cup. He looked at Abigail with the pale eyes that were not performing anything now, and she held his gaze without discomfort because she had looked at worse things and not flinched. You came here 2 months ago, he said to her. 4 months ago, she said. You don't understand what you've involved yourself in. I understand it very well, she said. I've read every document, every filing, every charter clause. I've spoken to every rancher you've pressured in this district. I've talked to a lawyer who has talked to the Territorial Land Office. She kept her voice conversational. What I've involved myself in is my husband's property and my neighbor's rights, and a 20-year pattern of deliberate manipulation, and I understand all of it clearly. He stood up. The chair scraped. This will not end the way you think it will, he said. You might be right, Abigail said. These things often don't. But the complaint is filed and the affidavits are signed and the documentation is in the hands of Sylvester Coombs and copies are held by 3 separate parties in 3 separate locations. So whatever you're considering as a next step, consider that first. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his hat and walked out. They heard his horse leave the yard. Cole stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, and Abigail sat at the table with her coffee and felt the particular tiredness that came after sustained concentration broke open into relief. He'll do something, Cole said. Yes, she said, but not what he would have done if we didn't have the documentation where it is. Whatever he does now will be visible. That's the difference. Cole turned from the window. Are you all right? She considered the question honestly. I'm tired, she said, and I want this to be over, which it isn't yet, but yes. He sat down across from her. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the snow from the storm was melting in the thin January sun, dripping from the eaves in the irregular rhythm of a thaw. The territorial examiner arrived in February, a deliberate, thorough man named Gordon Park, who spent 3 weeks in the district interviewing landholders and reviewing records, and who asked Abigail 17 specific questions about the complaint document over 2 separate meetings, and who wrote down her answers with the focused attention of a man who would remember them. Frederick Cale was removed from the Land Association Board in March, pending investigation. The 2 signed copies of Griggs's water management proposal were formally invalidated as part of a document that contained deliberately misleading legal language, a finding that Coombs had specifically requested and that Park had confirmed. Edmund Rafe in Denver provided a statement through his own lawyer. The statement was careful and limited, but it confirmed that he had received, on 2 occasions, consideration from a party he declined to name in exchange for processing certain complaints as resolved without examination. The territorial attorney's office was handling the rest of that. Vera Sykes's insurance recategorization was reversed. Her premium went back to its original rate, and her provisional standing was expunged from the association record. She came to the ranch on the day she received the official letter, walked into the kitchen where Abigail was working, put the letter on the table, and stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "I have 20 lambs coming in spring. I want to give you one." "You don't need to do that," Abigail said. "I know," Vera said. "I want to." Abigail looked at her. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Harlan Griggs did not go quietly, because men like Harlan Griggs do not go quietly. They go gradually, through a series of legal proceedings and counterfilings and negotiations that took the better part of 2 years to fully resolve. He retained his property. He was never charged with a criminal offense because the evidence, while sufficient to establish a pattern for the purpose of the association complaint, was not sufficient for criminal prosecution, and Coombs explained this to Abigail with the careful honesty she had come to expect from him, and she accepted it with the same. Justice and legal outcome are not the same thing. She had known that since the war. What happened to Griggs was something more durable than a conviction. The territory knew what he was. The ranchers in the district knew what he had done and had put their names on documents saying so. The Land Association reformed its board with a requirement for 2-year terms and public nomination processes. His standing in the district became the particular kind of standing that a man has when everyone knows his real character and has decided to work around him. Not destroyed, not imprisoned, but diminished in the way that mattered most to a man who had built his identity on being someone others deferred to. He never sent Cutter Walsh to the Brennan Ranch again. The old train station waiting room was converted by a vote of the District Land Association into a permanent medical outpost and traveler's refuge. The vote was unanimous. The cattle buyer from the Territorial Development Board had, as promised, remembered. There was a small fund established through the association and matched by the territory, and a woman named Abigail Brennan was named its first director, a title she accepted on the condition that she could continue managing the ranch work that she had been doing for months, and that the title not require her to wear anything other than what she already wore. Cole had laughed at that, an actual laugh, unguarded, and she had saved it without making a ceremony of it, stored it with the other things she was keeping from this year, the things she had not expected and that had turned out to be the most important ones. She thought in the years that followed about what people got wrong about starting over late in life. They thought it meant trying to recover what had been lost, going back to something, approximating youth through a different route. It was nothing like that. What she had found in Wyoming at 56 years old was not a second version of the life she'd had before. Thomas was gone, and that life was gone. And the woman who had lived it was changed by 30 years of nursing and loss, and the specific education of being useful to people in their worst moments. What she had found was something that could only have been built out of exactly who she was at exactly that point. The steadiness that comes from having weathered things. The economy with words that comes from knowing how fast time moves. The ability to look at a difficult situation without flinching because you have seen difficult situations and know that they do not last forever, even when they feel like they will. She could not have built this at 30. She did not have the materials. Cole understood this in his own way, from his own experience. He had lost his arm at 35 and spent 3 years rebuilding himself around the loss, not recovering what was gone. You could not recover what was gone, but constructing something functional and honest out of what remained. The advertisement he had almost not sent was proof of that. The ranch that worked, not in spite of how he ran it, but because of how he ran it, was proof of that. They were not each other's rescues. That was the thing people wanted to make them. In the stories that circulated through the district after the storm, and the petition and the outpost, the aging widow who had saved the one-armed rancher, the practical marriage that had become something more. People liked that story. It was cleaner than the real one. The real one was that two people who had already survived their hardest losses met each other on the far side of those losses and built something new out of the rubble. And the building was hard and imperfect and sometimes infuriating, and occasionally, in the kitchen at midnight with the ledger book and the cold coffee, genuinely good. That distinction mattered to Abigail. She was not Cole's salvation, and he was not hers. They were partners in a specific set of tasks that included the ranch and the neighbors and the fight against Griggs, and also, less dramatically, breakfast every morning and the management of a household and the slow, unannounced process of learning to live alongside another person after years of living alongside only yourself. Eli Pruitt stayed. He was 20 when he first handled the north fence line on his own, and 22 when Cole started teaching him the account books, and 24 when he took over the morning rounds with the authority of a man who had grown into his work rather than been handed it. He never quite lost the habit of checking with Abigail before major decisions, which was fine because Abigail never quite lost the habit of having an opinion. Dix Calloway retired at 63, not from the ranch exactly, but from the hard physical labor, and spent his remaining years in the bunkhouse being consulted and occasionally right about things. Ramon Torres married a woman from a neighboring family and built a house on the east corner of the property, and their children grew up calling the Brennans aunt and uncle in the easy, unexamined way of children who have not been told they shouldn't. Margaret Pettifer and Abigail never became warm friends, which suited both of them. They became something more reliable, two women who trusted each other's judgment and said so plainly and met monthly for coffee and spoke directly and without performance. And that was, Abigail had long since concluded, more valuable than warmth. Cole died in the spring of 1901, 27 years after a woman carrying one worn suitcase stepped off a train and walked past three men who thought she wouldn't last a winter. He had been slowing for 2 years and they both knew it. And the knowing did not make it easier, but it made it honest, which was the best they could do. He died in the bedroom with the east wall roof that had been patched in November of 1874 and had never leaked again. And Abigail was there, and Eli was there, and it was quiet. And it was enough. She went back to the train station on the evening of the day they buried him. Not because she had planned to. She had been driving the wagon back from the cemetery and had turned the horse toward home, and then, without quite deciding to, had turned it again toward the station. The waiting room was in use, as it generally was, 2 families she didn't know, a railroad worker with a wrapped ankle, an elderly woman waiting for a connection. The woman at the desk, a young person named Alice who had been managing the outpost for 3 years, looked up when Abigail came in and started to say something and then stopped, reading her face, and simply nodded. Abigail went to the old wooden desk in the back office, the one that had been there since before she arrived, the one with the drawer that stuck in cold weather. She opened it. Inside, in a cloth envelope, were the things she had put there years before. Cole's original advertisement clipping, her own first letter to him, or the copy she had kept, and the note he had written her in the 3rd year of their marriage that she had found tucked into the ledger book one morning with no explanation offered and none requested. She read the note. She had read it many times and it was still the same. The first draft of that advertisement apologized 14 times. Dix counted. The version I sent told the truth and nothing else. I thought you should know that the best decision I ever made was the one I almost didn't make, and that you are the reason I stopped apologizing and started just saying what things were. I don't know if that's a thing people say to each other. I'm saying it. She folded it carefully. She put it back in the envelope with the other papers. She closed the drawer. Outside the window, a train was coming in from the west, the sound of it building from a distant rumble into something full and close, and she watched it slow and stop, and the platform fill with the ordinary motion of people arriving and departing, some of them beginning something, some of them ending something, most of them simply moving between one place and another without knowing yet what the arriving would mean. She had been one of those people once. A woman on a platform with one suitcase and a decision that was final and a fear she was choosing not to let stop her. She was still that woman, older and slower, and without the person who had made the destination make sense, but still herself. Still the sum of everything she had built and everyone she had sat with through their worst nights and every problem she had refused to walk away from. You did not become someone else when you lost someone. You became more thoroughly yourself, which was sometimes harder and sometimes unexpectedly a kind of strange and private freedom. There was still work. There was the outpost and the ranch and Eli's management questions, and the spring lambs, including Vera's line, now in their third generation, and the land association meetings where Abigail still occasionally attended and occasionally said things that made newer members uncomfortable and old members quietly satisfied. She was 83 years old and she was not finished. That was not bravery and it was not inspiration, though people sometimes called it both. It was simpler than that. It was just the decision she had made on a train heading west in 1874, the one that was final, the one she had been making again every morning since. To be present, to be useful, to show up for what was in front of her without spending too much time grieving the map she'd expected to follow. Not every life that gets dismissed turns out to be over. Some of them are just beginning in the way that only becomes possible once you have stopped pretending to be something you never were. She put on her coat and went out to her wagon and drove home through the Wyoming evening, the wide sky above her going orange and then purple, and then the deep clear dark of a territory that had never once apologized for being exactly what it was. She did not look back at the station. She already knew what was there. She had built it herself.